So you're very welcome back to the What Moves Humans podcast. This is the fourth episode, the podcast where we examine what makes humans tick, how we relate to the world today in terms of how far it's developed in relation to how we've evolved and how the two of them interact and how we reconcile the two different things. If this is your first time listening, I would recommend that you go back and listen to the first, certainly the second and third podcasts, and potentially the first as well, so that you understand the fundamentals of some of the subject matter which I'm speaking about. So it's speaking about our human instincts and how they maybe affect certain areas in terms of making decisions and things like this. It's a large area, so there's going to be a few more podcasts probably defining some of the various different elements of us that they have an effect on. Something I spoke about briefly last podcast, which was about defining ego or sense of self, as I discussed then. So I'm going to do a little bit more on it today, and how your sense of self or your ego can also trigger quite a strong instinctual response that sometimes doesn't best serve us. Like I said, if this all sounds like new stuff to you, I would recommend that you go back and listen to the previous two podcasts. So I'm going to dive just to start off as an overview, the type of things ego can affect. It can affect your ability to communicate. It can affect your ability to accept reason or facts. Extreme current versions of that, both in group and in the individual. If you look at the argument over Brexit, a lot of the rationed arguments are just falling by the wayside, and it's become an extremely emotive thing, and people changing their position or saying that they said one thing when they, campaigned another. And for many people, they just seem to refuse any facts because it's become about an emotion. And many of the sort of approaches towards making people leave was to appeal to people's emotions. When you look at the individual, there's no better example of an individual than Donald Trump. Just this last week, you can see how his ego wouldn't allow him to admit that he had misspoken about the direction of a devastating hurricane, to the point where on national television he seemed to have drawn with a Sharpie or an indelible marker an extra sort of line onto a weather map which would prove his point that it was going to hit Alabama, but it was very obvious that he had done that himself, or he'd got someone to do it for him. But it was ridiculous. But what you're seeing there is someone's inability to back down from a position because they feel that this will appear badly or they'll appear weak or something like this. So this is where you're seeing ego and the instinctual response in the extreme. But for all of us, we are all subject to this, so we all have the same systems, but perhaps you just don't see it in as an extreme way. So first of all, I think, as we jump into this, I touched on it relatively briefly last week, but I'm going to speak again about ego and how to define it. If we were to say someone has a big ego, we don't equate that with someone who's not confident. So someone who seems outwardly very confident or very boorish or whatever it is, aggressive. Then equally someone who is shy, retiring, all of that sort of stuff, shuns the spotlight, don't speak up, all of that stuff. So this is all tied in with ego. Everyone has an ego. Your ego is just how you see yourself. It's how you actually, deep down yourself, see yourself. What can get tied up with that is how do you want to be seen? And for many people, they have a desire of how they would like to be seen, and this can cause them to do extreme things. And there's a scale to that on depending how much this desire to be seen in a particular light influences them. Now, how does this link to your instincts? There can be the muddle between how you see yourself and how you want to be seen. Even though it might be just on a philosophical or intellectual level that you sense you're being attacked, or challenged, then what are your instincts there for? Apart from, preserving energy and things like this, they're there to defend you. People who can be perceived as having a big ego can be very loud, overbearing, maybe argumentative, feel the need to, this thing of toxic male or masculinity, how being an alpha male is a bad thing. What is an actual alpha male? What I would argue is that someone who's actually confident in themselves, really confident in themselves, don't feel the need to outwardly express it all the time. And these perceived alpha males who seem to be this, those negative qualities that people associate with that term, overbearing, loud, potentially physically aggressive, unnecessarily so now. Those types of behaviours are more likely to be coming from a place of lack of confidence rather than confidence. So there's an overcompensation. If we compare to, actual alpha, other alphas, other species, you don't see a lion, a male lion, furtively looking over his shoulder. He's not going around just aggressing unless they've been directly challenged. It's not like any alpha male you see the same, gorillas, any of these, they're very relaxed because they're confident in their position as the alpha. Now when you compare that to humans who are perceived as being alpha males, then the opposite is true. It's, like I spoke about, those qualities which tend to be associated with toxic masculinity, but that is what I'm arguing, is that it doesn't come from a position of strength or feeling strong. Actually comes from feeling weak, so needing to overcompensate. The terror being, what if someone thinks I'm weak, so I need to outwardly show all the time rather than knowing that you're strong. How the instincts link here. These unconfident people, how they want to be perceived, how they are being perceived, it can make people do silly things. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Conor McGregor, the MMA guy. So this is someone who you might consider to be an alpha male. Now, I myself personally, I was a former martial artist. I spent a lot of time around professional fighters, and they generally tend to be some of the most humble people and calm, quiet, gently spoken people you come across. Potentially from their job is going in and fighting someone is whatever you think about it. It's a very tough thing to do, but a lot of the time what you see from people who do this is their job, this gives them a confidence in themselves in terms of their physical prowess that they don't feel they need to overcompensate. So that's why many martial artists that you'll meet and fighters, if anyone who has done it before, or any kind of jiu-jitsu players, anything like this, there tends to be a confidence that comes from doing these things, so that you don't feel the need to outwardly express your overcompensate. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, but that's what I would say would be the majority of people's experiences when coming into contact with people who fight professionally or martial arts or anything like this. Boxing is a little bit different, I think, because it just a lot of how they've promoted it and things has changed things. And now also someone like McGregor, obviously within martial arts, has changed how it gets promoted, and I would say a lot of martial artists are not particularly enamoured by his behaviours. Anyway, I digress. Most recently, we saw him punch an old man in a pub when the old man refused, in a kind of a rude way, his offer of a shot of his whiskey. Now, what causes someone whose job has been to, fight people for a living and done it very successfully, and, Conor McGregor is a great fighter. What causes them to feel the need to punch someone in the face when they refuse a whiskey, not just any person, an old man, because the ego is under attack. So there was an instinctual reaction. I don't think he thought that out. What are the mechanisms that happen to us? Someone says something, insult you, and it's like, oh, this doesn't matter, it's an old man. I have to defend myself now. How am I going to defend myself? I'm going to project. So he's insulted me verbally. Well, look, I'm going to dominate him physically now by punching him in the face to teach him a lesson. And then he'll never challenge me again. This is an instinctual reaction, and potentially, I'm not sure what the whole scenario was. Potentially, this guy had been drinking previous. So even further, with the alcohol and things like this, you tend to get more, you tend to be more subject to instinctual reactions because your alcohol will dull your sense of sensibility. And I don't need to tell anyone about people doing silly stuff when they're drinking. But that is a sign of someone, I would say, who's not very confident. To do something so silly as that, to prove their strength. So this thing of having big egos, this is not actually, it's someone, this is the thing, someone wants to have a big ego, or they want you to think that they're a big personality. That's maybe what a big ego is, but all the ugly behaviours or the less than attractive behaviours that you see, even people shouting over each other, that stems from people not being confident and finding the way to make themselves heard, or trying to act in a particular way to try to force you to see them in a particular light. It's an overcompensation. It can lead to all kinds of self-sabotaging behaviour. So this example I just gave of McGregor, it's a kind of an inability to accept any kind of criticism. With Donald Trump, inability to ever admit being wrong, to the point where you do extreme things. And there's different levels to this. I'm sure you know some people who maybe have, you can't even give them feedback without them feeling like they're under attack. Now, potentially with this, there's probably something gone on in maybe their background, how they've grown up, that has caused them to feel that any sense of attack or their instincts will immediately perk up as soon as they sense any kind of attack. They are like, okay, I need to go on the offense now. That is the best form of my defense. But again, as I've spoken about instincts before, they lack nuance, so they don't distinguish, whereas it's appropriate or not appropriate. They're not really very good at distinguishing between physical and verbal attack. They will just react. I am under attack, my ego is under attack, my sense of self, or how I want to be seen. I cannot let anyone think that I'm weak, so I must do something now. So you can see people mess things up a lot on their own lives, and they seem like they're their own worst enemies because they tend to be reactive people. When you see a toddler or 2 or 3-year-old kids at that age, they have no prefrontal cortex, which is a reasoning center. So trying to reason with them is a waste of time. They work completely instinctually, what they want right now. There's no reason you can give them as to why they can't get their way right now. And then it's just about I want or I don't want. And that's an unfiltered instinctual reaction. With adults, obviously, as we get older, we still have these instinctual responses, but we start developing our ability to reason, so a filter comes on. That filter can get inhibited when we're drunk or anything like this, which is why we tend to make sillier decisions. Males between 18 and 24, when the testosterone levels are at their very highest, and they still haven't got the fully formed prefrontal cortex, tend to do silly things. But there is actually something behind this. So you have your instincts, the high levels of testosterone, and not a full frontal cortex. So all of these things go into these types of behaviors, and they're all things to be considered. If we link all these things back to instinctive reactions, these examples which we've gone over there are very much fight responses or reactions. I think it's responses is not a good word. That implies that you've actually thought about what you're going to do. So we have our flight or freeze, and in terms of in terms of how that manifests in human behaviour today, particularly with things like philosophically or I would say cultural things, social things, is that, you know, these days we have this, massive outrage culture. And what is outrage culture, or, you know, and there's various levels to this, it tends to be a lot of deflection. People who would be seeking out people on the internet to out them and shame them and, you know, looking for reasons to say why they're not a good person. It's a deflection. It's, you know, again, it comes from a lack of confidence in yourself, and it's like, I don't want anyone to look at me. So what I'll do is pointing out how other people, how bad they are, but do not look at me. So this is, again, it's an internal dislike blamed on exterior things. And this is a form of deflection, this kind of whataboutism, and this is, you know, very much a way of hiding, or, you know, this is probably more of a hide response than a flight response. Some people, you know, I guess a flight response would be people would just, you know, step away or not go, you know, keep the head down, not say a word, whatever it is. But this deflection tends to be a hide, and, or, you know, to draw attention to someone else other than them. Do not look at me. And how else does this manifest? Well, even with shaming culture, and okay, this may be controversial for some people, but I don't think it's a particularly good thing. But this thing when if someone is fat shaming, or someone is whatever, you know, whatever shaming it is. Now, my position would be, like, of course people shouldn't be judged on how they look or what they do, or what their sex is, or what choices they make, and I have no problem with that. My only caveat would be is that they are comfortable within themselves internally. Often I think a lot of shaming type accusations come from someone feeling bad about themselves, and then they don't want to be reminded about it. So it's, and this is often the way we tend to look externally for things that are maybe causing our problems. But if you go through my last couple of podcasts, we make choices, things happen, and we decide how we're going to feel about them. And that is, once we're kind of aware of that, we can change this. But with a lot of the shaming culture, it tends to be the thing. This has reminded me of how I feel about myself, and I don't like that, so I am going to say that person is a bad person because you've reminded me how I feel bad about myself. An example I'm going to give is with the last Avengers film. One of the characters, Thor, has, after they, lost half the universe's population, lost loads of friends, and lost their fights and all this stuff. So they kind of skipped 5 years forward, and this guy, played by very, what would be considered a very good-looking guy, Chris Hemsworth, and all the other films he's been in, he's been in great shape, extremely well muscled, all this stuff. And when they skip to him, and this 5 years later, after they've had this devastating loss, he has become an alcoholic. He's eating really badly, and he's got fat, and he just, and he's kind of lost his mind a little bit, and through, he has several sort of periods throughout the film where he's crying about things he lost, and and it's really broadcast. This is someone who has suffered incredible trauma, kind of hiding from your reality, which a lot of like alcoholism and things like this are, is because you can't face reality, so you try to numb it. And there was a piece in the newspaper about how this was fat shaming. Now, I think the film went a long way to demonstrate that someone going through a traumatic loss can engage in behaviours that are not particularly healthy for them, which is self-sabotage. But this kind of gets boiled down to, this is fat shaming. So what I would say, that's not really the focus. It's like that's just showing what are maybe consequences, physiological consequences of living a specific lifestyle. So It would have been less honest if they had shown him still in this amazing shape, but trying to portray him as drinking and eating all the time. When you're demonstrating a deep trauma, these things tend to manifest. If you engage in bad behaviours, certain things happen, and that's just a fact. But it's physiologically, and it's nothing to do with ascetics or anything like this. But there's certain things that happen if you eat badly and drink all the time. I think a lot of the shaming culture comes from an inability to analyze ourselves, and because I would say at the head of all this, with all this stuff about ego, when actually if someone is totally confident in themselves deeply, they really like themselves, they like the person who looks back at them in the mirror, they feel their life is fulfilling, so they don't need to qualify themselves to anyone, or they have confidence in their personality, so if someone likes them, that's great. If someone doesn't, then that's their business. It's not something that affects them. Then I think these people are less subject to having reactions when they're attacked, because they're totally confident in themselves, and it would probably certainly be my experience with it. So you can see how instincts can really affect us, not just through our decisions in terms of preserving energy, but how it can maybe make us less effective at communicating and interacting with others, how it can make us quite cognitively inflexible, even in academia, something like this, because we feel our position is under attack. We can deny facts, talk about fake news or whatever it is, because it doesn't fit into the narrative into which we've hung our hats on and maybe how we identify. So it's just something to think about, and next time you're communicating or you're getting into an argument with someone, I think an easy way to sort of think about it is that if you're having a discussion with someone and it elevates an argument, are you more interested in listening to their points of view and maybe reconsidering your position, or trying to get your point of view across to them to make them reconsider, or do you just want them to admit that you're right and they're wrong? And this is often what discussions, when they turn to arguments, they become devoid of reason, and the main goal seems to be to get the other person to admit that they're wrong, which is very much an egoic response, or an egoic kind of outcome, or a desired outcome, but it's probably not the most important thing. And so that ability to be cognitively flexible and be open to new ideas and new, listening to reason to change your position is probably a healthier way to get things done, but also demonstrate someone who's confident in themselves because they don't feel they need to defend themselves all the time. So I hope you have enjoyed the podcast, and I hopefully, as always, it's given you something to think about, and maybe you've learned a couple of things that you may not have learned before. So thanks very much for listening, and I will be back soon with the next podcast. Bye. This podcast is sponsored by the Human Movement. The Human Movement facilitates your development of a framework for objective, optimal decision making for your most subjective problems. Up to a 90-day course with assessment on intake, on 30 days, on 60, and then on 90 days. Developing a new way of how you make decisions. Skill building for the mind that can be applied to any problems that you have personally had overcoming or implementing changes. Once we have developed this framework and started applying the principles, then it is just about habitualizing this as the way you make decisions. For a free consultation to see if this could be of any help to you, please go to thehumanmovement.com. Become superior to your former self.